looking at Ole Miss, a lot of people wrote that team off after losing to Kentucky and then blowing it against LSU. LSU's still in position. If they win out, they're going to go to Atlanta. So, that's not a terrible loss. And Kentucky's a weird team for sure this year. But Ole Miss has everything they want to play for, right? They win out, they're going to go to the playoff, I would imagine. And so, a team that throws for a lot of yards, a team that is very good offensively. I thought about this. The matchup last year was 1 versus 10, right? And had a lot of hype.
Right.
A lot of excitement, and that was very quickly vanquished, right? And
yes.
50 million to 17. And so, but this one does feel different. I'm not saying that, this is all, but this is almost their shot. Like, it's in the Grove. We've seen Georgia not look like Georgia. I'm not sold on Ole Miss, but, people do remember what your last game was, and they looked really good last week. And so this one does feel different than last year.
It does. And they were pretty banged up on the offensive line coming into that game last year, which is never a great recipe against Georgia. People will hate me saying this, but if you look at just Georgia's snap counts against Florida, it seems like Kirby kind of was gearing up for a big game at Ole Miss. Nazir Stackhouse played 56 snaps at Kentucky when that game was kind of this physical war that I think Kirby really wanted for some reason. And then you have him playing 58 at Alabama. He's a bellwether guy at defensive tackle who doesn't really move. He anchors super well. And he played a lot of snaps, everywhere basically along the way where Georgia was in a quote unquote big game, but he played 25 against Florida. So I feel like they kind of are sort of ramping up to this game and, have been kind of we want to manage guys to be ready to go and play a 4-quarter football game that we think is going to be hotly contested. Right. And, Ole Miss has done all this work to make over the offensive and defensive lines. Let's see what it's about. Right. Cause I think on defensive line, they have great pressure numbers. They have great sack numbers, all that. But, I watched them, Kentucky was able to block them some up front. I think Ole Miss's offensive line is still the question. Kentucky was able to kind of break everything they want to do offensively with their defensive line. LSU with their defensive line that's not even really been that good this year was able to kind of stymie them and have them hit a wall. So I think that's the question for this game is I think Ole Miss's defensive line can play with Georgia's offensive line at times well enough to, create some problems for Georgia, but can the other side of the ball sort of hang in enough in the trenches?
Yeah. They did look better against South Carolina, who has a great defensive line. That's the weirdest. South Carolina could be 7-1 right now had they,
they feel like a playoff team. I feel like they should be in the playoff. I really do.
Just unlucky to have just barely blown it against LSU, lost to Bama. But that Ole Miss game against them is one of the weirdest results. What were they? Man, how did they weren't even competitive in that one. And so, we talked about Dart. He number 1 in the league in passing yards a game, and then they run a lot too. They're top 5 in rushing yards a game, and so obviously they're going to be an offensive team under Lane. That's not really surprising. But if Georgia, does Georgia want to try and make them become one dimensional, just throwing the ball or just running the what? Obviously you're going to do your best to limit both. But what's the strategy on defense?
I think they want to make them throw the ball, and I think that Georgia I don't really think Georgia cares how you want to play them. As long as they're playing assignment football, they're going to be fine, but they always want to get you into 3rd and long. I think however Ole Miss wants to play 1st and 2nd, Georgia will be game for that, but they get you in 3rd and long. And you saw what they did in Austin. They pull out all these exotic pressure packages, and they bring Jalen Walker and Mykel Williams and Damon Wilson and, Tyron Ingram Dawkins. All these dudes are former 5-stars. They're all out there together. There's freaking 8 of them. And, you'll notice in a game like Texas or probably Ole Miss this weekend, Georgia uses those guys very differently than they do, some other weeks. And it kind of feels like, they only sort of put some of these pressure packages on tape when they feel like they really need to spin them. So it'll be interesting to see how this game, plays out. But I think you'll get, a Georgia that is focused and that like hears all the noise all over again. And in some way, that's the beauty for them of this this game that they just had. Like there's all these questions again. It feels like Texas all over again in a way. And I think you asked like does this feel like Ole Miss's shot? It does feel like Ole Miss's shot for sure. Like I do think they're healthier than they were last year coming into Athens. They have the home crowd this time, and they just have situationally more on the line in this game than Georgia does. Like this is their season. It's down to it. So yeah, we're gonna find out very quickly, I think, on Saturday, like how much is different. Just because Ole Miss, it feels like every time they get into a game with an Alabama or a Georgia or even sometimes an LSU, like it's kind of like Heupel in Tennessee, right, on offense, where it's like this cap sort of just comes down out of the sky, and it's like they can't really get over that 20-point mark, and a lot of things that usually work and look super sexy against the Arkansas of the world are not working because they can't block these teams up front.
I think the big game, like can't win the big game stuff, is something that is a little bit overrated. Like it's said, I don't know, it's said inappropriately to, in my opinion at times. Like you think about like James Franklin or Lane Kiffin this week or, Brian Kelly even at times.
Sure.
I mean, a lot of times they, that can't win the big game. Like, Penn State's, they shouldn't beat Ohio State, right? Like that should never really be like a thing. Like, yeah, maybe they upset them once or twice every 10, but Ohio State always has better players. They always are going to be favored in the game. And so like, yeah, is James Franklin like a big game fraud because he can't beat a team that's better than him every week? Or is Lane Kiffin a big game fraud because he can't beat Bama or Georgia? I mean, nobody else beats those teams either. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think those things are kind of over. Yeah, I think it's kind of overrated when they say those things about certain coaches. I don't know. Maybe that's a hot take by me. But anyway, but this does.
The answer is yes. I agree with you on all of these except for James Franklin, who really just can't win the big game.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's like some truth to, there's some truth to like both sides of all of them, right? Like at the same time, you're beating the teams into the ground. Like you talked about, like Ole Miss putting 70 on teams, and then they get into this one and they'll score like 17 this weekend. And you're like, bro, just scheme. Like, what did you do
that
here?
staff in particular, like they love to make hay while the sun's shining, right? Like
Sure.
They're at Ole Miss, and you see a lot of coaches do this. I'm not singling Lane out at all, but like when they have a chance to put a sexy number up, they do it. And it's how they recruit. Like that's how they try to raise NIL money. Like that stuff makes a difference in job security and fan enjoyment of the product, like in fan participation. So I don't hate it at all.
Yeah. When we talked about Carson Beck, when we were talking about Florida, the Florida game, do you think, and I didn't ask you this then because I wanted to kind of see what your take would be for it on this game. Do you think that what percentage of it do you think is on him, and what percentage do you think like things can be schemed a little bit differently? Like Georgia should stop asking him to do X, Y, Z at times, or that. And then part two, like how do you think he bounces back this weekend?
So I think there are a lot of things that are on his receivers, and I do a recap piece every week called 12 Takeaways that like is a deep dive long form kind of look at that week's game and the data points, right? Like what did we learn? What do we project going forward? And I think like the thing that I go back to is, Georgia's receivers have dropped 18 passes so far this year. They dropped 19 in all of 2023, right? And so, like, you've seen a lot of drop passes. You've also seen this, like, missed signal thing. Kirby Smart brought that up in his post game of like, we don't ask our receivers to do that much. And, we need them to do what we ask them to do, basically. And like, I asked him about it yesterday in his press conference. Like, you brought up these missed signals, kind of how do you solve that between now and Saturday when you go into a hostile environment in Oxford? And his answer was pretty vanilla, honestly, of just like, we got to practice it more. But, he was also like, you miss one of those and everyone's going to know about it. And
Sure.
and I think that's happened for Georgia this year. There definitely have been picks that Carson Beck has thrown where guys ran the wrong route, like the totally wrong route. So I think for Georgia, like, that has caused Beck to go into this spot of, what was he good at in 2023, right? He was really good at throwing guys open. Like, Ladd would be coming into his break and the ball would be coming out of, Carson would be starting his release and Ladd's coming out of his break. The ball is right on him. Like, it was beautiful to watch. Like, it was high level, NFL style kind of stuff. And I don't think he trusts these guys like that. And so he's waiting to see these guys open. The problem is that now he's staring guys down. And then, so yeah, there are things over the middle of the field where, like, I think Georgia needs to ask some hard questions of, should this route really be in the playbook right now until, we see Carson show he can throw it? Or, let's maybe not throw this route until we're up 17 in the fourth quarter. And then we'll find out if Carson can still, kind of look this off the way that he used to or whatever. But I also think a lot of these picks kind of come back to this like psychological spot. Against Mississippi State, I looked at someone next to me in the press box because he was like dropping dimes all over the field and guys were dropping passes. And I was like, really, right now, Beck and Bobo, the offensive coordinator, they have to like draw up and throw 2 winners on a 3-down set to get 1. Like, it felt like that at times this year. And so, I mean, I think 5 of his 11 interceptions have come on 1st and 10, right? And it's like, well, it's 1st and 10. Why don't you just flip this thing out of bounds and live to fight another day? And it's because I think he's started to overvalue every down. And that's a trust issue. It's also a confidence issue, I think, at this point as well. I don't know how you solve that, really, like, unless there's a, the kind of come to Jesus type moment. But I also would say that, like, when the chips are down, Arian Smith is shaking dudes out on that, out at Z and like creating space and things are happening. So I just think that they, these receivers for Georgia, they're not an overly talented bunch. They really aren't. And it's not just that is leading to some downs where, teams are they're bringing 7 and they're playing man on the back end or whatever. And like, guys just aren't open early in plays. And then the pressure comes and then he's trying to get rid of the ball. And then he does something ill-advised with the ball. So I know that's a really long, convoluted answer to your question, but I guess what I'm trying to, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that you are in a spot, if you're Georgia, where like, I don't know if you can scheme around it. I think you just have to kind of go with it and be who you are. And also, realize that like Carson Beck is still a really good quarterback and he still makes a lot of really good throws. And if you can just kind of like
there are going to be plays where he, turnover luck happens. Sure. Like his 3rd pick in that game, no one would care about it if it wasn't for the first 2, because that was he's in his throwing motion. He gets hit. The ball goes up in the air. It gets picked. It happens. That's part of football. But that is the reason why you can't have the first 2, is because weird stuff happens. Balls bounce weird ways, and you can't give this amount of field position up and negate all these yardage that you're gaining. Because what has impressed me from Mike Bobo, honestly, TJ, is like, people are asking like, oh, this is Bobo's fault that Beck's regressing. A, it's not at all. But B, dude, he, was playing a game against a number one team in Austin with a quarterback who, like, was on very shaky ground and not seeing things and not, I think, feeling very good about what he was seeing. And he goes and schemes up a touchdown drive to, like, push the lead back to 15. Like, he has kept stuff in his pocket, and when Georgia's needed it, he's pulled it out. He has a 44-yard end around to Dylan Bell against Florida that, like, comes off of a fake split zone motion look. Like, I mean, it's very high level play calling at times, and I think, like, Georgia fans should probably recognize that on some level, because, like, it's not like he's just sending Beck back out there every time to go and try and do the same thing he just did. Like, he's trying to manage it for him.
So Georgia, a slight favorite here. The spread kind of surprises me a tad. I mean, I guess, there's some recency bias maybe in just the way that Beck has played and the way that Ole Miss has looked here recently. But spread pretty close in this one. I think I'm leaning Georgia here. I mean, this is kind of one where, Lane's got to prove it to me type thing. And maybe I do buy into the big game, can't win stuff. So, but thoughts on a prediction or where you're leaning on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think Georgia, they're a good fourth quarter team, and that doesn't really fall into the favor. Like, I know Ole Miss has upgraded their talent and all that stuff, but, like, Georgia still has eons upon eons more depth than an Ole Miss has. Their first 22, I think, are, competitive, right? But that's the hard thing for Lane is, like, do I run tempo like I want to run tempo in this game? Or do I get into a spot where, each play that comes, I'm at a bigger disadvantage after a certain number of plays have happened? And I think that is probably the case in this game. I lean Georgia just because I, stood in the rain in Athens last year and watched that game. I know there's no Bowers, there's no McConkey, but, like, I do think what Georgia did to Ole Miss's run game last year was pretty thorough. And I haven't really seen anybody run the ball on Georgia this year in a game where they put their best run defenders out on the field together for 4 quarters, honestly. And so until I do, I'm going to assume that that's not going to happen. I think Ole Miss can run the ball some, but I think this will come down to Jackson Dart. The truth of the matter is the stuff he does with his legs is great against a lot of teams. With Georgia's linebackers and the mutants that they are, like, doesn't matter. He's not fast enough to matter with his legs against Georgia. So I like the way Georgia probably matches up with them defensively. And I think this game kind of comes down to, like, the safeties for Georgia. Ole Miss is so boom or bust in a lot of ways with their passing game. And last year it felt like they were waiting all night to find good windows to throw into downfield, and they never really came. And then Dart started forcing them, and Georgia started picking them off. So as long as Georgia's not -3 in the turnover column, like, I think they'll move the ball well enough in this game to go and score a decent amount of points. I actually think this could be a game where, like at Texas, Georgia's forcing turnovers of their own and giving their offense short fields. And it'll be interesting to see, as good as I think Ole Miss has been kind of rushing the passer, I also think that there are some times where you see some teams able to kind of do some things with them in the run game. So we'll find out very quickly on Saturday afternoon in Oxford, what this is going to play out as. But I like Georgia in this spot. I think Georgia will have some things up their sleeve, both personnel-wise and scheme-wise, to get this done. Because as much as everyone's talking about how important this game is for Ole Miss, it's important for Georgia too. Like, they got left out of the playoff last year. I think they were one of the 4 best teams. I think most people would agree with that. They don't want to be in a spot again where they're sort of counting on the committee, and that's where they will be if you start getting into 2 losses, and then you have to white knuckle the rest of the season with Tennessee kind of coming home to face you. So we'll see.
Graham, I appreciate you for hanging out. Thank you for fighting through the technical difficulties that we had today. Where can people follow you? Where can they find more of your work?
If you want to check my work out, come and find me at dogcentral.com, Dog Central on YouTube, Dog Central podcast feed, pretty much everywhere, Dog Central, Dog Central, Dog Central. And you can follow me on Twitter at Graham Coffee DC. TJ, thanks for having me, man. Always a pleasure.
Appreciate Graham Coffee for his time and stopping by and chatting UGA Ole Miss. Hey, we've done a ton of content for both teams, especially Georgia this year. If you've made it to the end of this video and you appreciate it, we will certainly get Graham back again. Do me a quick favor, hit that subscribe button. Doesn't cost you a thing and certainly helps us out here at College Football Addiction. Appreciate you guys for hanging out. We'll talk to you soon.